Why don't you have a seat over here, and I'll introduce you. Okay. We'll introduce after, okay? I'll introduce you after. Hi, good afternoon. Can you hear me okay? Good. Thank you all for being here. We have a wonderful colloquium today, but just to begin, please make sure that your cell phone is off, okay? And we want to ask you to, to not leave until the Q&A and the discussion part is completed, all right? So I'm Dr. Michelle Loris, and I am delighted to welcome you to today's Bergoglio Lecture. The Bergoglio Lecture is Sacred Heart University's and Catholic Studies' signature lecture because it speaks directly to the heart of the mission of Sacred Heart University, which is rooted in the Catholic intellectual tradition. The Bergoglio Lecture was established to invite renowned thinkers, theologians, speakers, who would showcase Pope Francis's work extending, expanding, developing the Catholic intellectual and social traditions in the work that Pope Francis does in the world today. And so we could not be more honored, Archbishop, than to have Archbishop Bernardito Hausa here as our speaker today. His Excellency is the current Apostolate Nuncio to Spain. He was born in the Philippines, and he was ordained a priest at Santa Rosa in California. At the university at Santo Tomas in Manila, he received a licentiate in philosophy, a licentiate in theology, and a master's in education. At the Pontificate University of St. Thomas Aquinas, he obtained a licentiate in canon law and a doctorate in sacred theology. He attended the Pontificate Ecclesial Academy to prepare for a diplomatic career in the Catholic Church. And he entered the diplomatic service of the Holy See, and he worked in Madagascar, the South Indian Ocean, Bulgaria, and Albania. Pope Benedict named him the Apostolic Nuncio to Haiti. Pope Francis appointed him the permanent observer of the United Nations in New York City, and later he appointed him an Apostolic Nuncio to Spain, which is where he comes from to us today. At a committee meeting in the United Nations, he was speaking about the rule of law, and he said, "The rule of law is bound by dignity, respect, and justice." He said, "The ultimate and the essential goal of law is to guarantee human dignity and to promote the common good." And today he will unfold the meaning of these words that are central to the Catholic intellectual tradition as he talks to us about Pope Francis's work and the migration crisis that we face today. I could not be more honored or delighted than to bring to you Archbishop Hausa.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much. At the very outset, I would like to thank Dr. John Patillo, the president of the Sacred Heart University, and the whole of the Sacred Heart University community, of course, with Michelle over here. I think this forum is called Dr. Michelle Loris forum. Is that right? Yeah. I just overheard about it. It has been very recent. So congratulations, Michelle. So I was asked to deliver one of the Bergoglio lectures celebrating the 60th anniversary of the foundation of your university. And thank you all for coming today. And I am being asked to give a reflection on one of the defining themes of the Bergoglian pontificate, and namely his tireless advocacy in favor of people on the move. People move for all sorts of reasons. People move as an expression of freedom to go and live and work in places that they like most. Others are forced to move within one's country or cross international borders. Those who cross international borders, either they do so freely or they are forced to. As we say, either legally or illegally, either in a documented or undocumented manner, whether in a regular or an irregular manner, or whether they pay somebody to smuggle them, or they are smuggled across borders by people who are trafficking them. Others cross borders because they are oppressed, or they risk their lives if they continue to live of their country of origin, and so they seek protection in another country. And thus, with all these kinds of people in the move, we designate these people in the move differently, because while all of them deserve to be respected and their human rights respected and they need care, they are also subject in different ways to national and international law. That's why we call people in the move documented. That means they're legal or regular. We call them undocumented. That means they are irregular, and sometimes we call them illegal. Some migrants are just free to move around. Some migrants are forced to move. There are those we call internally displaced persons. There are those who are displaced in the international or cross borders. Some of these are smuggled. Some of them are trafficked. Some of them we call refugees, and still some others we call asylum seekers. I will try to clarify to which people in the move I shall be referring to as we go along on our reflection. Last September 23, there was a summit in Marseille, which is in the Mediterranean, the French Mediterranean, and one of the topics there was migration, especially the migration crisis in the Mediterranean. And because the Pope just couldn't say no when it comes to migration summits, so the Pope went to Marseille just for a day. So in his flight back to Rome, he was asked by one of the journalists in the plane. He said, 10 years after your visit in Lampedusa, do you know where Lampedusa is? Of course, it's in the Mediterranean. It's the southernmost island of Italy. It's already somewhere, it's actually nearer to Malta and to Libya than to Rome. And he said, 10 years after that visit, that was in 2013, in July 2013. Do you think that the situation of the migrants are better off now than it was 10 years ago? Or is it worse? The Pope said, well, I cannot say that it's worse. I think I would say that the change has been very slow. He is very diplomatic. Are you, so they ask it, do you think that the European countries, because we're talking about Europe here in this context, do you think that you have failed to convince European governments to have more generous migration policies? And the Pope said, I couldn't say that, but I think there has been a very slow change. He said, the change has been very slow until you arrive at a crisis point. He said, it's like handling a hot potato and you do not know what to do with it. I don't know what you think about that. Do you think that the migration situation or the situation of the migrants in the United States is better now than 10 years ago, or has it been worse? Do you think that the Americans are more conscious or more aware of the phenomenon of migration, not only in the United States, but also in the world? And I think, for the purpose of asking me to give this reflection, is we would like to see really the migration phenomenon on a worldwide scale, not only in the United States, because after all, Pope Francis is the Pope for all the Catholics and for the whole world, not only for the Americans. Although I understand that they are more interested on the American situation than in other parts of the world. But anyway, yesterday you must have seen a Gallup survey, which says that the survey was, the data of the survey was collected between February 1 and February 20. And it was published yesterday, so this is very fresh. It's the first time after so many years that migration, or immigration, to be more precise, Americans consider immigration as the biggest problem the country is facing. 28% of the Americans think, could you imagine, in the whole of 1923, the Americans thought that the biggest problem was the government, with exactly the same percentage, 28%. And only in a matter of 2 months, that has completely turned around, that more and more Americans think that the immigration is the country's biggest problem. So I think we thank the Sacred Heart for inviting me to give. Actually, they asked me to choose between Laudato Si and the migration, but anyway, I saw that Laudato Si has been very much in the program of the Bergoglio lectures here, so I opted for migration. So if you think that almost a third of the Americans believe that immigration is a problem, and I think we have to ask why. I would like to, Michelle already read a little bit of my CV, but as somebody who worked in the diplomatic service of the Holy See, I have been assigned to different countries. I lived in Madagascar, in Mauritius, and I live in Albania, in Bulgaria, in Britain, in Italy for 12 years, in New York for 7 years and a half. I was twice at the United Nations, more than 6 years in Haiti. And that was very, very recently, 2008, 2014. And I also lived in Spain. I have lived in Spain for almost 5 years now. I can see that in all these countries, I think I can see the drivers of migration, and I can see why people move, and I can see their main problems, and I can see why they are forced to move. And besides, I'm a Filipino. The Philippines has around 115 million population, and around 12 million of those, a little bit more than 10%, are immigrants. Around 4 million in the United States, around 1 million in Canada, of course, including my family. Around 1 million in Saudi Arabia, could you imagine that, where you could not even bring in a Bible? And we are all Catholics almost. Around 1 million at the United Arab Emirates, and around 500,000 in Western Europe, mostly in Italy, and around 40,000 in Spain. And then I mentioned my own family. In 1964, my eldest brother, at 18 years old, migrated to the United States. And then the second one followed. In 1968, they were American citizens. They asked my parents to move. We are 12 children. My mother just resisted. My father either didn't want to come. My mother said, I don't even know where it is, of course. I said, we will not move. Finally, in 1976, there was martial law in the Philippines, and the economy just went down the drain. And my elder brothers, I'm number 8, just were about to finish the university. And it was very difficult to find a job, etc. And even you could not even have a knife almost under martial law. My father threw all his pistols to the sea. because he didn't want to surrender them. And then finally my mother decided to come to the United States in 1978, and my father as well, and then the rest of the siblings. But they never came until 1985. Did all my studies in the Philippines. Now, seeing all this, why even in my own family, I could see why my parents really were not completely free to move. My mother, above all, just resisted. But after, certain circumstances, she was kind of constrained to move. But she was not forced. That is another category. We were not persecuted directly, but we were in a situation where it was more and more difficult to live a normal, dignified life, at least from our point of view. When I was in Rome, I lived for 12 years there. There are so many Filipinos in Italy, mostly in Rome and Milan. So every Sunday, practically, I celebrated Mass with them. Mass was always followed by lunch. Lots of lechon, cochinillo, and lots of Asian noodles, and lots of rice. And in all these gatherings, people always share their experience. How they got there, who brought them there, how much they paid the coyote, where did they pass, what deserts they used, etc., etc. Because most of them were undocumented illegal migrants. The Italians are very generous. We have had lots of amnesties. So really around more than half of the Filipinos, certainly in Italy, are not only legal, many of them have become citizens. Now, what have I learned from them? It's almost always the same thing what I've learned from Filipinos in New York. The same reasons why people move. When I was in Haiti more than 6 years, I could understand why, in spite of really endangering their lives, they move. They would even swim to Florida if they can. But the Haitians, I would say most of them, they don't know how to swim. That's part of history. So that is, how could, I think living in those conditions, you could understand more the reasons really, the deep reasons why people move. And in spite of all the perils, difficulties, and all the possibilities of being rejected. But of course, migration is not today. You would agree with me that migration is as old as humanity itself. It's not a cliche, it's a fact. Since the earliest time, humanity has been on the move. I think the best example that we have is the Bible. Abraham, really the first, we might say, historical figure in the Bible, in Genesis. Abraham moved so far away at the time. He abandoned his country of the Ur of the Chaldeans in Iraq. He migrated to Canaan. And everybody else. And we have Joseph, who migrated to Egypt. But all these are, I always love to think of these two types and two examples of migration in the Bible. Because if we talk about the Pope Francis teaching on migration, and I think we could not understand it without returning to the Bible. But I think the Bible is really a story of migrants and for migrants, The biblical scholars would tell you that. The big bulk of the Old Testament was written in a short time, and that was during the exile in Babylon and after the exile. And that's why you have books and chapters and even entire books dedicated to figures, personalities in the Bible who were either exiled, deported, or migrants. You have Abraham, you have Joseph, you have Ruth, you have Esther. All these figures are involved on people on the move. So if you see Abraham migration, it's paradigm. It's the same model of migration up to our times. And I'm sure it will always be the same because we are all the same human beings. He migrated freely. Nobody forced him to migrate. Most probably there could have been some elements why he migrated. Probably the grass is greener always on the other side of the fence. Probably he thought that there was better grass for his for his animals in Canaan than in Ur. Could be true, but we don't have that. But the thing is, the Bible doesn't tell us that he was forced or he was exiled or he was deported. He freely migrated with his family, with his animals, and everything. And you look at Joseph. Joseph did not freely migrate to Egypt. He was sold by his own brothers. So that's also one of the good points of reflection in that even our own brothers are willing to sell us to slavery and oppression. And I think certainly there is no better example of migration in the Bible than the house of Israel itself. When Joseph was in Egypt, Egypt was able to save itself from famine and from drought because Joseph was very wise. They did, what is wise when you are facing, difficult times. You save, you put the grains into, etc., etc. And that's why his brothers went there. His brothers did not want to go to Egypt, but they were constrained. They were forced to go to Egypt looking for food. How many of the migrants in our times are exactly like that? Why do they leave their own country, their own security? Because they are in situations of extreme poverty. They are in places of drought. Now it's very en vogue to say they are in places victims or being affected by climate change, etc. So really, the drivers of migrations haven't changed. But this example, of course, of the house of Israel is a round-trip migration. By this round-trip migration, you see more that the drivers of migration are as old as Genesis, we might say, as old as humanity itself. So in the whole of Israel, we're already in Egypt, we know that. They were oppressed there. We might say the Egyptians became envious of them. So there was oppression, there was discrimination, and indeed murder of children, etc., etc. So you know that when the baby was a boy, they had to be killed, etc., etc. And we have the story of Moses. And so a people oppressed, a people in very violent, conflictual situations, they tend to move. Not only tend, they are forced to move. It's just like how many people from Afghanistan, how many people from Congo, how many people from Somalia, from Ethiopia, from Sudan, move across international borders because of violent situations. That is not new, and yet that is a fact in our time. The whole people of Israel went back to Canaan because they were oppressed. 40 years of wandering in the desert. Wandering in the desert, they did not stay in the desert because they were in search, finally, of the promised land. How many people move? Because they see greener pastures on the other side. How many people move? Because they find life better in another land. Each of us, I guess, is in search of our promised land. And that is just the biblical summary, we might say, of migration. If you look at the world, the first centuries before Christ and the first centuries after Christ, the Jews, the Phoenicians, the Romans, the Greeks, or the Aramaics, or the Armenians, or the Arabs, and all the tribes of Canaan, etc., they were all over the Mediterranean. They were mixing, they traveled, and there are, again, many causes of that. Not all the Jews who migrated were exiled or deported. Many of them migrated for better opportunities. Why did they go to Rome? Why did they go to Athens? Etc., etc. And if you look forward, the fall of the Roman Empire, as we call, the barbarians were at the gate. They were not only at the gate, they were occupying the Roman cities in ruins. And then you have the Goths and the Visigoths driven out of southern France by the Franks. I live in Spain, so I love the story. The Visigoths invaded, we might see, Spain, driving out the Vandals, mixing themselves with the Iberian Romans. You know, you go to Spain, don't forget to visit Roman ruins, because Spain is full of ancient Roman cities. So with the mixing of the Goths, the Visigoths above all, because the Visigoths, I mean, they are the Goths of the south, or the east, or the west. And the mixed with the Iberians, that's why we have the Hispanics. Here, of course, you call Hispanics those who come from Latin America. But the original word, meaning of Hispanics, they were the Goths and the Romans mixing and coming up, we might see, with a new people, with a new race, and that is the Hispanic. Only to be conquered, driven out, and occupied during 700 years by the Arabs, by the Maghreb tribes, etc., until, as we know, the fall of Granada, or you might call it the surrender of Granada in 1492. More than 700 years of being occupied. And yet, in spite of that, of course, the Hispanics not only survive afterwards, but they have become prosperous, and they went as far as Latin America and the Philippines, etc. And then you just go on. I am an Asian. 8 centuries before the Spaniards arrived in the Philippines, it was already the golden age of trading with the Chinese and the Arabs, etc. So everywhere in the world, people were moving across centuries, within centuries, and everywhere. If you look at the United States, really the population of the United States is called, you call yourselves the melting pot. The beginning, especially of the 19th century. All the Europeans came to New York, to the New England states. The Italians, the British, the Irish, and then you have the Czechs, the Poles, the Nordics, the Germans occupying the Midwest, Chicago became the second biggest Polish city in the world after Warsaw, etc. So you could see that America is composed of migrant people. You go to the West, the Chinese, the Filipinos, the Koreans, the Vietnamese. You go to the South, you have lots, of course, Latinos everywhere in the United States. And yet, we see, I think, the United States probably has been the most successful experiment in that sense. All these people coming to the U.S. are what we call the tesserae. They are the pieces of what is now America. Now, why would you say yesterday that is such a huge problem? Certainly, there are evolution of thoughts, and there are indeed situations which could justify us saying that now immigration in the United States is a problem. So who are we talking really about? Who is a migrant? I mentioned earlier a number of terms like internally displaced person, undocumented migrants, irregular. I would like to refer specifically to what we called international migrants. These are, as defined by the United Nations documents, migrants really practically refer to international immigration, to international migrants, whether immigrants or immigrants. They are people who are born in one country and then cross to live or work in another country. They are specifically, legally defined as the migrant. And I would like to use that sense, that definition of a migrant. So that is how the international community agrees to define a migrant, who is actually an international migrant. Falling within that definition is actually a very small minority of the world's population. The latest UN data that we could consider complete is that of 2020. According to this 2020 data, there are 381 million migrants. Only migrants. We are not talking about refugees. We are not talking about internally displaced persons, etc. This is 2020. This 381 million was, in 2020, 3.6% of the world's population. You would think that it's not a huge problem. But of course, in terms of concrete numbers, it is huge, 381 million. 25 years before that, in 1980, the percentage of the world's migrants of 116 million at the time was only 2.7% of the world's population. And in 2015, which was considered the biggest migration crisis in the last decades, and that's why we have the Global Compact for Migration and the Global Compact for Refugees, because of the crisis of 2015. In 2015, the percentage, there were 281 million migrants, 2015. So in 5 years, it grew by 100 million. And at the time, though, the percentage of the migrants to the world's population was only 3.2%. So that means there has not only been increase of the concrete numbers of migrants, there has also been an increase of the proportion of the migrants to the world's population. I don't think we could even appreciate, we might say, the reality or the impact of these numbers when we think that the most horrendous war, the most horrendous conflict that the world's ever known was the Second World War. After the Second World War, there were 11 million displaced people inside their own country or outside their own country. Now, consider that between the internally displaced and the international migrant now, there are more than 400 million people. So it's really, in terms of number, that's big, but in terms of the 8 billion people population, you might think that's small. But consider that the American population, more or less now, is 331 million. So you imagine, let's say, more than 100%. You might say 445 million people displaced. That is just the sheer meaning of that number of people who are either migrants or internally displaced. So I think these figures really give us also a kind of understanding why people consider migration, above all, irregular migration, as a huge problem. Now, in 2015, with so many of these people, especially from Afghanistan, Middle East, the Syrian war, etc., that were pressing to the European Union borders. So the world, of course, the one in Texas has always been there. Now most probably it's bigger. And the United Nations decided to call a summit to face this crisis. So in September 2016, there was a summit at the United Nations here. I was already the permanent observer of the Holy See by then. I was here twice at the UN, 2006, 2008, 2014, 2019. I was there almost 8 years. So more or less, not only that I could see it, but of course, being the head of the mission at the UN, of course, I was directly involved with the negotiations. So there was, this feeling that the world must act together in order to give an answer to the international migration crisis. So in that summit in 2016, a document was agreed upon by all the states. It was called the New York Declaration on Refugees and Migrants. It's a big document. It's a document full of promise and pregnant with wonderful objectives, we might say. But I would like to point out just why this document is important. The first is a recognition of a general principle, which the Holy See was really been a big contributor to this, that when it comes to respecting human rights, there must be no distinction at all of any classification of migrants. Every migrant, regardless of their migrant status, their human rights must be respected. So that's the general principle. The second has even more, we might say, bigger consequences. The objective at the end of this declaration is that the world must come together to negotiate a global compact for safe, orderly, and regular migration. There was a parallel global compact on refugees, but it was not intergovernmentally negotiated. It was written by the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, of course, consulting the member countries. But the Global Compact for Migration was negotiated by all the member countries and the Holy See as permanent observer, word by word. And finally, in 2018, this Global Compact for a safe, orderly, and regular migration was finally accepted, adopted in a summit in Marrakesh in December 2018. So what is this Global Compact all about? The problem with this Global Compact, in a sense, it's also its salvation, its redemption, is that it is not binding. Nobody is forced to apply it. It is practically a declaration of intentions. It is a political statement in a sense. But of course, it has that pressing invitation that since all the states in the world welcomed, accepted this Global Compact, then they must be at least morally constrained, or they should constrain themselves to apply, to implement at least the most fundamental objectives of this Global Compact. So that is where we are. I think I would end this because, how long? 15, I don't know how many minutes I still have. I would go directly now to to what is Pope Francis, the core of the teaching of Pope Francis on migration and his view of migration. The Holy Father thinks really that there is a crisis, but he couldn't probably see it directly that this crisis is getting worse because we are doing nothing. The Holy Father says, yeah, we are doing something, but we are very slow. That's very diplomatic. Anyway, that is how it is. And I think, given in front, facing this crisis, I just think, just like the Sacred Heart University, that we can ignore it. Why is the Pope, everywhere he goes, talks about the migration crisis? And why should the Church care? And I don't think we really cannot but care. And Michelle just told me that most of you are studying the big documents of the Catholic intellectual tradition, and certainly not only the intellectual tradition, but the most important documents of the Catholic Church. And certainly one of them, with the name Gaudium et Spes. It is the pastoral constitution on the modern world during approved or adopted in the Second Vatican Council. That's why it's titled, if the document is in Latin, its title is always the first, second, or three words of the document. And that is called Gaudium et Spes, because the first three words of the document is Gaudium et Spes. And I'm sure you know already this quote because it is so celebrated. Because the document opens by saying, the joys and the hopes, the griefs and the anxieties of the men of this age, especially those who are poor or in any way afflicted, these are the joys and hopes, the griefs and the anxieties of the followers of Christ. Indeed, nothing genuinely human fails to raise an echo in their hearts. I think that is a fundamental guiding principle why every one of us should care about the migration crisis. Because it's not only a crisis, it concerns above all millions and millions of people. So that's why Francis has dedicated, and migration themes is really one of the defining themes of this pontificate, together with documents like the Laudato Si and the question of caring for our environment. So the Pope always insists on the moral urgency to care for those who have been displaced and to respond together to the root causes of their displacement and forced migrations. In particular, he has focused very much on the most vulnerable of those people in the move, especially those forced people in the move, the migrant children. There are just millions of them, even in Spain, and women and girls who have been trafficked, above all, for sexual purposes. With moving gestures and powerful words, Pope Francis shows his concern and his solidarity with those forcefully displaced and constrained to immigrate for causes beyond their control. His trips to Lampedusa and to Lesbos, most recently to Marseille, and who knows, he might go to the Canary Islands for migrant reasons again, were fundamentally expressions of this concern for the migrants. The heart and the spirit of Pope Francis' teaching on what should be the Christian and indeed a human response to migration is nothing else and nothing short of biblical. I wouldn't go to that because we wouldn't have time, but I already give you one of my greatest favorite example of migration and the drivers of migration in the Bible, and indeed, I think, in the whole of literature and human history. The entire house of Israel migrating to Egypt and migrating back to the Promised Land. If you look at that, you will see all the drivers and the causes of migration. So I would just like to mention, I hope we could remember at least some. I would like to summarize, there are hundreds of documents and speeches and homilies, etc., of Pope Francis on migration. So it's almost impossible for us to read. And of course, we ourselves, we invent conferences as well. We do lots of research, we do a lot of interpretations in order to, just like imagine how many thousands of pages we had to write in negotiating the Global Compact, because the Holy See was very, very active, because the Pope was always asking, what are you doing? You try to be rather active there, don't sleep. So we did. So every day we traveled here and there in order to negotiate. Actually, I would mention that later, that really the real key, the real heart of Pope Francis' teaching on migration are those four verbs, of which I'm sure you already know. I will mention that as the last point. But the first of the principles that I'm pretty sure you will agree, because this is also a principle that is universal, and I think it's very rare to find a state which would disagree. They might be silent, but they wouldn't say that they disagree with you. First, that Pope Francis really insists and constantly reminds us that migration is both a natural response to a person's need. It is a natural response to a situation of crisis. It is a natural response of a desire. It is a natural response to an innate desire of every human being for happiness, for freedom, greater opportunities, and a better life. It is an expression of a person's quest of his personal promised land. Of course, as I will say later on, we understand that every country is sovereign in stating and formulating its migration policies. But it does not mean that you should take this away from every one of us, that we want to move as a response to our freedom and our desire to live, as the UN would say, life in larger freedom. We are always in search of something better. And if we search for something better, we move. The second principle that Francis has asked us in our negotiations to always insist is, there is both the right to immigrate or to migrate, to make it simpler, to make it neutral. Of course, you immigrate or you also emigrate. There is the right to migrate, but there is a prior right to this right. So there is the right to migrate, but there is a prior right to remain. There is a prior right to stay. This may sound very simplistic. This may sound too obvious, that if I don't want to move, I won't move. I have the right to stay. But in the context of the migration crisis, this is practically a huge statement because of its consequences. The implication of this statement is that how do we exercise the right to stay, the right to remain? Again, we go back to the drivers of migration. Because the important here is that for people to be able to exercise the right to remain, we must fight and eradicate the root causes that force them to migrate. I'm talking not 100% universally, because these are people who are so okay in one place. You know, there's a very good retirement for people in New York or people in Connecticut, and you want to go to Florida. Why would that be? Now they're looking for the sun, warmer weathers. As I always say, in the Mediterranean coast, in Costa del Sol, in the Balearic Islands, in Canary Islands, there are 30 million British, Germans, etc. Why are they? And yet we don't even think that they are migrants. They are there, I said, to retire. There are 15 million of them along the Costa del Sol. So that is the implication of this. If we want people to exercise the right to remain, if we don't want people to move, then we must ensure that where they are, they can freely exercise the right to stay. The most common root causes of migration are extreme poverty, violations of human rights, in particular massive and grave violations of fundamental human rights on the part of dictatorial regimes, persecutions by extremist and fundamentalist movements, civil wars and regional conflicts, which is really one of the strongest drivers of today's forced migrations, the inability of poor countries and peoples to minimize the devastating consequences of natural catastrophes and climatic changes. So if we want to avoid these crises to the point that people are forced to move even against their will, we must eradicate or minimize the causes of migration so that everyone can exercise his or her right to remain where he or she is. There is one mantra that we always use during the negotiations, the Holy See delegation said, migration needs not to be a disparate act. That means migration needs not to be forced. You know, this, I'm not, modesty aside, I think, of course, people also agree with the Holy See. So there was a pool, or we might say, of thoughts about this. But I'm very glad that, especially first in the declaration, the Holy See really appeals to the international community together to create conditions that allow communities and individuals to live in safety and dignity in their own countries. This is a statement which is in the New York Declaration, and I'm glad to say we have contributed much on that. And in the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration, there is a paragraph there, number 13, which we succeeded in inserting. There it says, we must work together to create conditions that allow communities and individuals to live in safety and dignity in their own countries, etc., etc. There are a number of references to that in the Global Compact, and I might say that we did contribute to that. The third principle in the teaching of Pope Francis, I would like to underline is the insistence that voluntary, safe, orderly, and regular migration is beneficial to all the parties involved. Because there is really that a little bit, especially in wealthy countries, migration is a problem because the migrants, the newcomers, are a problem to the host countries. The Holy Father would like to kind of balance that in a sense. Migration, if it is voluntary, safe, orderly, and regular, benefits the country of origin. First, let's talk about the country of origin. We know that. What's the percentage of the Haitian gross national product is composed or is there because of the remittances of the Haitians outside? It's more than 50%. So do you think that Haitian migrants are not beneficial to Haiti? There is the other side of the brain drain in countries like Haiti, where there are few professionals, we might say, to cover the needs of the country because they are all out working outside. But there is also this positive side that practically half of the economy is possible thanks to the remittances of the migrants and the investments of the migrants themselves. This migration benefits the destination countries as well, in form of mostly cheap but fundamental services. And for many of the destination countries, especially in Europe, migrants help to fight demographic winters and provide much-needed care for their aging population. I have lived in Europe for 18 years, and I know that. I lived in Italy, I lived in Spain, and I know more or less the United Kingdom, etc. I lived there as well. So, do you think that, how many old people in Italy or in Spain, how many healthcare centers, how many retirement communities would not be able to pay their own expenses if it were not for cheap labor of the migrants? How many farmers, how many farming communities would just close the following day if the migrants in Spain would leave? Which is almost like 20% of the population. So all this would tell you that these migrants, sometimes with great sacrifices, and sometimes also with a certain rejection on the part of host societies, they are actually contributing to the host country. And finally, above all, this migration regularly benefits the migrants themselves and their families. It's almost useless to say that because that is so obvious. Sparing the migrants from the horrors of human smuggling and trafficking, emancipating them and their families from extreme poverty, freeing them from dictatorial regimes, etc., etc. In a word, sparing them with what would consist in an undignified way of living. That is the third principle. Migration benefits all. The fourth principle that I would like to mention is that the fundamental human rights of all migrants, regardless of their migration status, must be respected. Again, there is an objective at the Global Compact number 15. We fought for it. We fought what we actually fought was we wanted in the Global Compact that there must be a taxative, explicit enumeration of the basic services that all migrants would be entitled to regardless of their migrant status. There was not an agreement on that, but if you look at the Global Compact Migration number 15, objective number 15, it says, to ensure that all migrants, regardless of their migration status, can exercise their human rights through safe access to basic services. It's, in principle, the same, but there is no explicit enumeration, like the children have the right to education, that certainly they have the right to all the basic services like health, etc., etc. Now I think I should finish my talk with the sixth principle, which is really the core of Pope Francis' total body of teaching and speeches and reflections on the migration crisis. And this is the four verbs. I hope you will remember these four verbs because these four verbs capsulize. Some would say four active verbs. I think there's no need to say active, but verbs are in themselves active. So he said to capsulize the whole teaching of Francis, said to welcome, to protect, to promote, and to integrate the migrant. These four verbs are the key contents of a very short video message that Pope Francis sent to the last preparatory conference before the formal negotiations of the Global Compact. This was December 2017 in Puerto Vallarta in Mexico. I was the head of the delegation, and we asked the organizers to please play this video that the Pope sent, and they readily agreed. So it was put at the inaugural section of the conference because some of the delegations, they were willing to pack up their bags and willing to go home because they did not agree on a number of principles. Anyway, so they played it, and really it was very well received, I would say. It's a very short video. It's less than 5 minutes. And these 4 verbs is what is the message all about in this short video. So after the inaugural, during the coffee break, after the inaugural session, so everybody was talking about it. So I jokingly told my colleagues, the delegation of the Holy See, I said, well, after that, I think we could spend the rest of the time on the beach in Puerto Vallarta. I mean, to emphasize that we were indeed satisfied with how the message of the Pope was received. These 4 verbs can be further summarized in one word, in one term, and that is solidarity. And what the Pope, in another document that is entitled Fratelli Tutti, Fratelli siamo fratelli, sorelle tutti, that we are all one. There is universal fraternity. And if there is this universal fraternity, then we welcome, promote, protect, and integrate migrants. And we remember what Moses always told the people of Israel during the 40 years of wandering in the desert. We are all strangers in a foreign land. I think that's the Pope Francis have cited it so many times. In this respect, there was a phrase that we of the Holy See delegation beat to death during the whole process, namely that migration is a global challenge and that demand a global response in shared responsibility to welcome, to promote, to protect, and to integrate. We keep on repeating that because we do believe that it is the core of the Pope's teaching on migration. I don't know how long it is already. I think I have already. So I have the explanation to those 4 verbs that I would skip that because that would make my conference even longer. So I think we would stop there, and I would just, as a form of conclusion, the best way again is to repeat those 4 verbs. And I think the Pope Francis teaches us that the best way to ensure an integrated approach to migration is to focus really on the human person. The human person, the migrant as a human person, as the center of concern. And to consider migration in a bigger picture, not only as a problem, but as a challenge from which all of us can win, all of us can benefit. To welcome, promote, protect, and integrate the migrant is to facilitate the migrant's integration in the host country, his ability to help the family back home, and thereby helping the origin country as well. Everyone wins. I admit that the concrete situations are much more complicated than that, and there are endless barriers for migration to be beneficial for all. But Pope Francis believes, indeed, that there is no better alternative than to welcome, promote, protect, and integrate the migrants. Thank you very much.
No, not at all. Thank you. Thank you so much for such a wide, sweeping understanding of the drivers, wherever you want, the drivers of migration, Pope Francis's response. What we want to do is spend a few minutes with questions, comments, reflections on the focus of the migration crisis here in the United States. Open it up. Come on, don't let me be the first one to start. Questions, reflections?
Well, I will take more if you don't ask questions.
Yeah, no. All right. Oh, here we go. Good. Hold on.
Hello, Bishop. I was wondering what your perspective is about where the moral obligation to be welcoming and help migrants and refugees lies. Is it with the governments or is it with just ordinary people and institutions in the community?
Well, certainly it's at all levels. But the greater moral obligation is really in the individuals, because the individuals are not limited to what we call policies. The question of one of the paragraphs I skipped on my text is, suggestions about it. The Holy Father has made it so much suggestions on how to make migration more legal, more regular, more safer, etc. Because in spite of the fact that we are advocating these four verbs, we also recognize and respect the sovereign rights of sovereign states to have, or groups of states to have their migration policies. So the moral obligation of states or groups of states or international organizations is very much constrained by their responsibility to maintain order, to have the law observed, while we as individuals, there is no such constraint. We could dedicate ourselves better to integrating migrants, because really the question of integration of migrants is really equals to community activity, to community involvement. So it's the level of your local community where nobody would constrain you not to participate in activities that would make the migrants feel more welcome. That the migrants, for instance, in Italy, we celebrate Mass. Immediately after the Mass or before Mass, because it's a whole activity, we have several lawyers. We have several teachers of Italian. These are, in spite of the fact that these are what we call illegals, we don't say illegals anymore because that doesn't sound good. We call them undocumented, sans-papiers in France, or simply irregular. So our community, our chaplaincy provides legal advice, provides housing for those who just arrived. We provide possibilities for them to advance and to get more salaries by speaking Italian. And in fact, the evolution of the Filipino migrants in Italy to a better life, to a much better arrangement was extremely fast. Practically the first migrant to Italy was a young lady, a girl practically, who was working at the nunciature at the Vatican Embassy in Manila. The nuncio in 1976 was about to be transferred to Brazil. And before he left, a young couple, friends of his in Italy, was looking for a babysitter. And he sent this girl to Italy. And after him, the door just opened. And why was it that already, when I was there in the second part of the 80s, I lived in Italy as a student, why is it that in a very short time, most of the Filipinos were already living in apartments? They were not living anymore in the houses of their employer, simply because they learn how to speak Italian, they have their legal documents, and then they put themselves together, better organized. We could rent an apartment so that we don't have to live with our employer in a very short time. So I think this is beside the fact that most of them are illegals. If you are a government, you are constrained not to do that because you would be violating your own laws. And besides, that's one problem in Spain now. Why is it that the government would not give money to care for the irregular migrants? Because it is a European policy that irregular migrants must not be made to feel themselves almost regular. Instead, they have to be repatriated. That is one question. States, we respect that states have the right to make their own migration policies, but we invite them to make these migration policies in a way that they would facilitate what we want. We want these migration policies to facilitate a better and more welcoming, more protecting, more humane migration policies.
Thank you. Question? Yeah, Charlotte? Okay. Yes? Yeah, okay. All right. Yep.
Archbishop, thank you so much for such a riveting talk. I was struck by your first words, much like a magisterial document, a people on the move. And then the last of Pope Francis's verbs, integrate. You're making me think of another phrase from the council, the pilgrim people of God, as an image for the church. My question for you, what can landed church folk, not migrants, learn from the migrant experience? In other words, what is the migration crisis perhaps teaching the church about what it means to be human?
Well, I think that the migration crisis has been, is, and will teach the church certainly is a better awareness that we cannot control migration by ourselves, because I've said there are so many drivers of migration. If we want to control migration, as I said, there is a prior right to remain. But to make them exercise that right, they have to be free to exercise it, and they must not be constrained to. So if we want to contribute to control migration from that point of view, then we must contribute to the development of a country, for instance. We must invest there. We must give them education. We must try to make them more, as we called, more resilient to natural catastrophes, to climatic changes, etc., that way. But if they're already here, there is no way that the church would not allow us to kind of hate them or reject them. So that's why, I think the Catholic Church really, even in Spain, the Catholic Church is very much in opposition. The Canary Islands has, the last 3 months of last year, I think more migrants arrived in 3 months of last year than in the year between 2006 and 2010, where there was already a crisis of migration in the Canary Islands. So just imagine the size of migrations. And there is this policy that these are all illegal migrants. They arrive with boats and traffickers. They would, because Mauritania, all the way down even to Senegal, all the way down to Ivory Coast, the traffickers and the smugglers, mostly smugglers, because of course there is a technical difference between smuggling and trafficking. You pay somebody to smuggle you, to help you go through the border. But if you are trafficked, it is against your will to go there. While smuggling, you're paying somebody. If that is not your will, I don't know what it is. But anyway, they would bring those migrants, railway migrants, on big ships, and then they would start putting them, when they are not far from the Canary Islands, they put them into small boats in a way that these small boats could hardly get to the islands. That means that there is no way to reject them. There is no way to send them back, because either they would die right there in front of you, or you rescue them. So that's the problem. Now, with the policy of the European Union, the government would not directly, there is the policy not to help the migrants feel themselves at home, so that because they would be repatriated. So the governments would go around that policy a little bit, so that they would bleed a little bit of money through different screen organizations, we might say. The problem is we want the money directly. We want it now, and we want it big, because most of the houses where the refugees are being housed are ours, schools, convents, etc. And Caritas is so active there. So in that sense, I think the crisis really, I think, if we want it and if we are open to it, the crisis really makes us more concretely, we might say, it does concretize our own teaching, our own moral impulse, we might say, to help. And I could see that it is all over the place. There are reactions. There are people who said that they should not come. There are people who said if they are illegal, send them back. It's very hard for us to say that, really. I think we have a moral repugnance to that. And yet, we do respect that countries have laws. We do respect, why is it so many of my friends would say, well, we migrated legally, and now they have arrived and they have come illegally and they get visas here. We worked so hard to get our visas to be regular, and now they have arrived and now we're helped. I think it's kind of unfair. I mean, I'm sure you have heard of those people like that. But I think slowly people would realize that, it's crisis time is, as the Chinese, the meaning of crisis in China is not a problem, it's a challenge. You create something positive out of it.
Your Excellency, thank you so much. I think today you have your talk and the message you bring from Pope Francis helps many who respond to the migrant with fear and then subsequently hatred or bigotry to be challenged maybe with the message of love and solidarity that you bring from Pope Francis. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Michelle.